For many in the medical profession, the act of alleviating suffering is a profound reward. Yet, for Donald Harvey, it represented an unparalleled opportunity to wield absolute control over the lives of others. His narrative would eventually expose dark secrets that had lingered in obscurity for nearly 20 years. What could drive a nurse to take the lives of his vulnerable patients? Was he attempting to liberate them from their pain? Or was there a far more malevolent motive at play? Born on April 15, 1952, in Hamilton, Ohio, Donald Harvey was the eldest of 3 siblings. With his expressive brown eyes and tousled curls, he was affectionately known as Donnie by his parents, Ray and Goldie Harvey. Shortly after his arrival, the family relocated to Boonville, Kentucky, a quaint community nestled in the eastern foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Here, Ray toiled as a tobacco farmer while Goldie devoted herself to nurturing their children and managing the household. Despite their love for one another, the couple struggled against the harsh realities of poverty, which began to strain their marriage. Nevertheless, they remained caring and supportive parents to their 3 children. Donald, a reserved child who often preferred solitude, exhibited no overt signs of abnormality. Yet, perhaps the roots of his sadistic tendencies were planted deep within his troubled past. Reports suggest that Donald endured sexual abuse at the hands of at least 3 different men from the ages of 4 to 21. Among his abusers was an uncle who preyed upon him during family visits, as well as an older neighbor who lured him with money for illicit favors. At 18, he alleged that his roommate, Randy White, assaulted him. While a traumatic history cannot justify horrific actions, it may provide fertile ground for analysis by psychologists and criminal profilers. Throughout his school years, Donald was often seen as a solitary figure, shunning social interactions and extracurricular activities in favor of immersing himself in books. While his academic achievements garnered him commendable grades, they also branded him as the teacher's favorite, inviting a wave of teasing from his peers. Upon completing his studies at Steigen Elementary School, Donald transitioned to Boonville High School in 1968. Despite his impressive academic performance, he soon found himself disenchanted with the monotony of school life, leading him to make the decision to drop out. He later obtained his diploma through a correspondence course based in Chicago and earned his GED the following year. At the tender age of 16, Donald was adrift, lacking any clear aspirations for his future. He eventually moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he secured a position at a local factory. His tenure there was promising until the plant faced a downturn in 1970, resulting in his layoff. Shortly thereafter, his mother reached out, urging him to visit his ailing grandfather, who had recently been admitted to Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. Unbeknownst to him, this visit would irrevocably alter the trajectory of his life. During his daily visits, Donald cultivated a rapport with the hospital staff, who appreciated his presence so much that they extended an offer for him to join their team. Thus began a harrowing odyssey of chaos and turmoil that would span nearly 2 decades. The true reasons behind Donald's desire to work as a nurse's aide may remain shrouded in mystery. Some speculate that financial desperation drove him after his job loss. Although he lacked formal training as a nurse or doctor, the hospital staff placed their trust in him. His responsibilities involved spending extensive hours alone with patients, performing tasks such as changing bedpans, inserting catheters, and administering medications. While caring for patients was undoubtedly challenging, Donald's initial weeks at the hospital passed without incident, until a singular encounter with an elderly patient triggered a profound shift within him, marking the unsettling onset of an incomprehensible series of events. On the evening of May 31st, 1970, Donald found himself tending to Logan Evans, an 88-year-old stroke victim, during his shift. As he entered the private room to check on Mr. Evans, the elderly man unexpectedly smeared feces across Donald's face. Although the stroke had likely impaired Evans' mental faculties, the incident ignited a fury within Donald, leading him to lose all semblance of restraint. In a moment of madness, he smothered the frail man with a blue plastic bag and a pillow. Once Evans lay still, Donald employed a stethoscope to confirm his demise. He then disposed of the plastic bag, meticulously cleaned the body, and dressed it in a fresh hospital gown before showering and alerting the nursing staff. Strangely, no one raised an eyebrow or questioned the circumstances surrounding the death. Having tasted the thrill of taking a life, Donald's appetite for violence only intensified. The very next day, he was assigned to care for 69-year-old James Tyree. In a grave error, Donald selected an improperly sized catheter, which prompted Tyree to protest vehemently. In a fit of rage, Donald restrained him until he succumbed to an air embolism, resulting in a fatal bout of vomiting. Once again, the absence of suspicion allowed Donald to act with impunity. Just 3 weeks after his initial act of murder, he callously cut off the oxygen supply of 42-year-old Elizabeth Wyatt. He later referred to these acts as mercy kills, justifying his actions by claiming he was fulfilling her wish to die, as she had expressed a desire to escape her suffering. 4 hours later, a nurse discovered her lifeless body, yet still, no one questioned Donald's involvement. With the hospital staff oblivious to his dark deeds, Donald seized the opportunity to unleash his inner predator, resulting in the deaths of 15 patients over the next 10 months, while under their care. The motivations behind each of his heinous acts ranged from twisted pleasure to cold experimentation, employing a variety of methods: suffocation, tampering with oxygen supplies, administering fatal injections, and inducing overdoses. It appeared that he would resort to nearly any means to extinguish a life. When provoked, his tactics grew increasingly savage. On one particularly chilling occasion, following a dispute with a patient, Donald stealthily entered the room and cruelly inserted a coat hanger into the catheter, piercing the bladder and bowel. This brutal act led to a devastating infection, resulting in the man's death days later. Yet, in his warped mind, Donald rationalized these atrocities as acts of mercy. The self-styled angel of death sought to assume the role of a deity over the lives of the vulnerable, shrouding his horrific deeds in the guise of mercy killings. On March 31st, 1971, precisely 1 year after his inaugural murder, Donald's tenure at Marymount Hospital came to an end. That evening, he was apprehended for a burglary committed in a drunken haze. In his inebriated state, he made a garbled confession about the murders to the authorities, but his words fell on deaf ears. Ultimately, he faced charges of petty theft, evading prison time by paying a substantial fine. Although he managed to elude serious consequences, this incident marked a pivotal moment in his life, albeit briefly. In the ensuing months, Donald endeavored to restore some semblance of normalcy, eventually securing a position as a part-time nurse's aide at Cardinal Hill Hospital in Lexington. By June 1973, he had taken on a second nursing role at Good Samaritan Hospital in Lexington, juggling both positions until he sought new opportunities. Between August 1974 and September 1975, he transitioned first to a telephone operator in Lexington, then to a clerk at St. Luke's Hospital in Fort Thomas, Kentucky. Remarkably, during this period, Donald managed to suppress his murderous impulses, perhaps due to a lack of access to patients, which may also explain his frequent job changes during this time. In his relentless struggle to suppress his murderous impulses, the darkness within him grew increasingly unmanageable, ultimately compelling him to cross the state line into Cincinnati, Ohio. In September 1975, Donald returned to Cincinnati, swiftly securing a position on the night shift at the Cincinnati 5A Medical Hospital. There, he donned multiple hats as a nursing assistant, housekeeping aide, cardiac catheterization technician, and autopsy assistant. As he reacquainted himself with the hospital environment, he resumed his sinister activities with alarming ease. The nocturnal hours afforded him minimal oversight and unrestricted access to every corner of the facility. Over the next decade, Donald would go on to claim the lives of at least 15 patients during his tenure at the hospital. To indulge in his malevolence, he meticulously chronicled each murder in a detailed diary, noting the gruesome specifics of his acts. His methods included lacing a patient's dessert with rat poison, suffocating them with a plastic bag and wet towel, injecting cyanide into intravenous lines, and spiking orange juice with arsenic and cyanide, among others. Yet, the depths of his depravity did not stop there. Throughout his killing spree, Donald experimented with various techniques, drawing inspiration from medical journals that offered insights on how to better mask his heinous deeds. Cyanide quickly became his weapon of choice, seamlessly integrated into his victims' meals or directly administered through their gastric tubes. Over the years, he stealthily accumulated an astonishing 30 pounds of cyanide, which he stored at home for safekeeping. Despite the trail of death he left behind, Donald Harvey skillfully evaded detection. He orchestrated each murder to appear as mere accidents or natural occurrences. His colleagues even bestowed upon him ominous nicknames like the Angel of Death and the Kiss of Death, oblivious to the chilling coincidence of his presence during these tragic events. Unbeknownst to them, their affable colleague concealed a predatory nature beneath his charming facade. Years later, Donald would claim that his transgressions were acts of mercy, driven by a misguided sense of compassion. Yet, the evidence of his darker deeds told a different story. The dawn of the 1980s heralded a transformation in both Donald's existence and his malevolent actions. These acts were undeniably fueled by a tempest of rage and a thirst for vengeance. In the early 1980s, Donald embarked on a tumultuous romance with a man named Doug Hill. From the outset, their relationship was fraught with conflict, marked by frequent arguments. Following one particularly heated dispute, Donald resorted to a sinister act, introducing arsenic into Doug's ice cream. Although Doug survived this harrowing encounter, it marked the first time Donald had attempted to inflict harm beyond the confines of the hospital, a chilling indication that his monstrous tendencies were expanding. After yet another clash with Doug, Donald sought solace with a new partner, Carl Hohler. Initially, their relationship flourished, but soon suspicions of infidelity clouded Donald's mind. Consumed by jealousy, he began to lace Carl's meals with small amounts of arsenic, ensuring that Carl would remain too unwell to leave their shared abode. At this juncture, Donald's vengeful actions transcended the boundaries of home and workplace. In a particularly egregious incident, he tainted a drink belonging to a female neighbor with hepatitis serum, nearly claiming her life before the infection was identified and treated. Fortune favored her, but it would not extend to another neighbor, Helen Metzger. The arsenic he infused into one of her pies ultimately led to her demise in a local hospital just a week later. With each successful evasion of justice, Donald's confidence soared, leaving him with an intoxicating sense of invincibility. In April 1983, following a dispute with Carl's parents, he began a systematic campaign of poisoning, administering arsenic in small doses to their meals. On May 1st, 1983, Carl's father, Henry, suffered a stroke and was subsequently admitted to Providence Hospital. To fulfill his unresolved intentions, Donald discreetly infused arsenic into his pudding during a hospital visit before departing. Tragically, the elderly gentleman succumbed later that evening. For the subsequent year, Donald intermittently attempted to poison Carl's mother, Margaret, yet his efforts to end her life proved futile. In January 1984, Carl ended his relationship with Donald and requested that he vacate the premises, a decision that left Donald in a state of discontent. Unable to reconcile with the rejection, he devoted the next 2 years to plotting the demise of his former partner through his lethal mixtures. In a fit of vengeance, Donald even orchestrated a failed murder attempt against one of Carl's female acquaintances. Although he managed to land Carl in the hospital at one point, his endeavors to erase him from existence were ultimately in vain. The first hint of suspicion surrounding Donald emerged on July 18, 1985, when security personnel observed his peculiar behavior and opted to inspect his gym bag. Within the confines of the bag, they uncovered a .38 caliber pistol, hypodermic needles, surgical scissors, gloves, a cocaine spoon, an assortment of medical literature, 2 books on the occult, and a biography of the notorious serial killer Charles Sabd. Fined $50 for possessing a firearm on federal grounds, Donald was subsequently presented with the choice to resign quietly rather than face termination. Whether by sheer fortune or gross oversight by law enforcement, none of these incriminating items ever made it into his employment record, and the hospital administration refrained from launching an investigation into his potential involvement in other crimes during his tenure. It took Donald 7 months to secure a new position at a local hospital. In February 1986, he commenced work as a part-time nurse's aide at Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati. Oblivious to his dark past and impressed by his capabilities, his new employer soon elevated him to a full-time role. Before long, Donald seamlessly slipped back into his familiar patterns. In the span of the following 13 months, Harvey claimed the lives of an additional 26 patients and made several attempts on others by disconnecting life support systems, injecting air into veins, inducing asphyxiation, and administering lethal substances such as arsenic, cyanide, and petroleum-based cleaners. This 2-decade-long killing spree culminated in a final act of murder on March 7th, 1987, when 44-year-old John Powell met an untimely and mysterious end. Powell had been on life support for several months due to severe injuries from a motorcycle accident, but had shown signs of recovery prior to his death. Under Ohio law, a mandatory autopsy was required for fatalities resulting from vehicular incidents, placing Donald in an unprecedented predicament. During the autopsy, an assistant coroner detected a faint almond scent, a classic indicator of cyanide poisoning, prompting authorities to take a closer look at the circumstances surrounding Powell's demise. Initially, suspicion was directed toward those closest to Powell. However, investigators found no evidence or motive implicating his friends or family. Soon, attention shifted to hospital staff who had access to Powell's room, with Donald Harvey emerging as a prominent figure on the list. To clear their names, hospital employees willingly submitted to polygraph tests, and Donald, too, expressed his willingness, even purchasing a book on how to outsmart lie detector examinations. Yet, he ultimately failed to attend the scheduled test, citing illness. Compounding the situation, investigators uncovered his dubious history at the VA hospital, along with his infamous moniker, the Angel of Death, attributed to the string of unusual fatalities linked to him. Consequently, authorities honed in on Donald as the focal point of their investigation, bringing him in for questioning. During the initial interrogation, Donald vehemently denied any involvement in Powell's death, casting himself as an unfortunate victim of mere coincidence. After enduring hours of intense interrogation, complete with a theatrical display of good cop, bad cop tactics, he ultimately admitted to introducing cyanide into John Powell's G-tube. He attempted to justify his actions by expressing sympathy for Powell and his family, yet he steadfastly denied any involvement in the other mysterious fatalities. Donald was subsequently taken into custody as investigators commenced their search for additional evidence. On August 11, 1987, at the age of 35, Donald Harvey sat down with authorities and confessed to a staggering 33 murders committed over the preceding 17 years. As the investigation unfolded, this chilling number swelled to 70. Skeptical of his claims, investigators insisted on a mental health evaluation before accepting his assertions as truth. Following a series of psychiatric assessments conducted by various specialists, it was concluded that Donald possessed the capacity to distinguish right from wrong and was capable of adhering to legal standards. Thus, he was deemed sane and competent. In November 1987, Donald Harvey received a sentence of 8 life terms, plus an additional 20 years for the murders at Mary's Mount Hospital. By February 1988, he pleaded guilty to 3 more homicides in Cincinnati and 3 attempted murders, resulting in 3 life sentences alongside 3 terms ranging from 7 to 25 years. The inquiry into the remaining deaths was ultimately closed after 2 years, as investigators found insufficient evidence to link him to those crimes. Whether met with shock or revulsion, the public remained captivated by the enigma of his twisted psyche. In a 1991 interview with a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch, Donald Harvey revealed the motivations behind his heinous acts, offering a rare insight into his disturbed mind. He articulated that his reign of terror was born from a yearning for control. For 18 years, he felt dominated by others, and in his view, he had finally seized control of his own fate. He relished the power that came with deciding who would live and who would die. In the grim annals of serial killers, Donald Harvey occupies a uniquely chilling position, distinguished not only by his staggering number of victims, but also by the unsettling reality that many were individuals he knew personally, alongside his patients. An article from the Associated Press, dated July 23, 2001, ranked him as the most notorious serial killer in the United States, eclipsing even the infamous John Wayne Gacy. While the world anticipated that Harvey would languish in prison, ultimately succumbing to the natural course of life, fate had a more violent conclusion in store. On March 28, 2017, the 64-year-old Harvey was discovered brutally assaulted in his protective custody cell at the Toledo Correctional Institution in Lucas County. He succumbed 2 days later, the victim of blunt force trauma resulting from a skull fracture and severe brain injury. Shortly after his demise, an inmate named James D. Elliott, serving a 37-year sentence for multiple burglary offenses, confessed to the murder in a letter to the Toledo Blade. Elliott recounted how he had punched and stomped Harvey, motivated by a desire to provide closure to the families of Harvey's victims, some of whom were his own relatives. I hope that those from our community find some comfort in knowing that one of their own delivered the justice Harvey should have faced in court, Elliott wrote. In September 2019, he was sentenced to life imprisonment after pleading guilty to the murder of the notorious Angel of Death. Throughout his life, Harvey maintained that his killings were acts of mercy. Yet, in his transformation from caregiver to killer, he assumed the roles of judge, jury, and executioner, perhaps emboldened by the decades he evaded capture, believing he had the right to dictate the fates of others. A family embarks on a seemingly idyllic retreat to their weekend residence, only to vanish without a trace. After a harrowing month of silence, the grim discovery of their decomposed remains, infested with maggots, reveals a chilling truth. They had perished shortly after their arrival. This tragic fate befell the young Perry family on November 5, 1993. Michael Rubenstein, a resident of Louisiana, had taken his stepson, Darrell Perry, his wife, Evelyn, affectionately known as Annie, and their 4-year-old daughter, Crystal, to his vacation cabin in Summit, Mississippi, seeking a brief escape from urban life. Their anticipated return was met with growing concern as weeks passed without any communication. On December 16, 1993, driven by dread, Rubenstein ventured to the cabin, only to be confronted by the horrifying sight of 3 decaying bodies teeming with maggots. What sinister events transpired within those walls to lead to such a macabre revelation? Were the victims of a violent intrusion, or did a more profound enigma surround their untimely demise? Let us delve into the circumstances that led the Perry family to such a tragic end. The Perrys resided in New Orleans, Louisiana. Doris Perry, a devoted single mother, became Doris Rubenstein following her second marriage to Alan Michael Rubenstein, a cab driver. While Rubenstein had a daughter from a previous relationship, Doris brought 2 young sons into the union. 24-year-old Darrell was wed to Evelyn, known as Annie, and together they cherished their daughter, Crystal. During the early 90s, Darrell found himself incarcerated, a period during which Annie engaged in an affair. Meanwhile, Crystal was cared for by Doris and Rubenstein, who disapproved of Annie's indiscretions. Upon Darrell's release from prison in the fall of 1993, Rubenstein encouraged the couple to rekindle their marriage, suggesting that a getaway would be beneficial. He graciously offered them his cabin in the tranquil town of Summit, Mississippi, a place far removed from the bustle of city life. On the fateful morning of November 5, 1993, prior to her departure for the cabin retreat, Annie encountered her dear friend, Sue Bellow. Sue implored Annie to reconsider her plans as her birthday was approaching. In a gesture of loyalty, Annie assured Sue that she would return before November 16th. With that promise, she set off with Rubenstein, who drove the family on a 130-mile journey from New Orleans to their secluded cabin. After dropping them off, he returned to Louisiana, taking his vehicle with him. Without a telephone in the cabin, Darrell and Annie relied on the phone of their neighbor for communication. On November 11th, Annie reached out to Sue, discussing the upcoming birthday celebrations. She expressed her feelings of boredom in the cabin and reiterated her intention to return home before the promised date. However, as November 16th came and went without the Perrys' return, Annie's mother, Zula Locke, began to worry. After weeks of silence, Zula consulted her daughter's mother-in-law, Doris, and sought guidance from Rubenstein regarding the cabin's location. He cautioned Zula that finding the cabin alone would be a challenge and volunteered to check on the Perrys himself. After several delays, Rubenstein finally made the trip to the cabin on December 16, 1993. Upon opening the door, he was met with a horrifying scene. The decomposed bodies of Darrell and Annie lay in the living room, the television still flickering, while in the adjacent bedroom, little Crystal was found lifeless on the bed. The grim sight was compounded by the presence of maggots, with Darrell's eyes having been consumed and a gaping wound in Annie's abdomen. In a state of panic, Rubenstein alerted the neighbor and promptly contacted the Pike County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff C.V. Glynis and investigator Donald Lindley arrived to discover the tragically decomposed remains of the family. Strikingly, the cabin itself was orderly and untouched, devoid of any signs of a struggle. Subsequently, Rubenstein was summoned to the Summit Police Department, where he provided his account to the sheriff. Rubenstein revealed a timeline spanning 1.5 months, recounting his testimony that he had dropped off Darrell, Annie, and Crystal at the cabin on November 5, 1993, before returning to his residence. On November 11th, Darrell reached out to Doris and Rubenstein to discuss their return plans. Rubenstein indicated that he would be available to collect them on November 26th. However, upon arriving at the cabin on that date and knocking, he received no response. Although he typically possessed a key, he had unfortunately forgotten it that day. Inquiring with the neighbors about the Perrys, they speculated that the family had likely returned to New Orleans. Subsequently, Rubenstein returned to Louisiana, only to revisit the cabin on December 16th, this time equipped with the key, where he was met with the tragic discovery of his family's lifeless bodies. Dr. Emily Ward, who performed the autopsy, determined that Annie had succumbed to multiple stab wounds, with no defensive injuries present. She had been stabbed 8 times in the chest, including 2 fatal wounds to the left lung. Daryl's remains were significantly decomposed, yet the autopsy indicated he too had perished from lethal stabs to the chest, lungs, and heart, with defensive slash wounds on his arms and a 7-inch gash across his neck. Crystal's autopsy revealed hemorrhaging in the neck, with strangulation identified as the cause of her death. Dr. Stephen Hain, a forensic pathologist, asserted that the homicides had likely occurred nearly a month prior to the discovery of the bodies. A neighbor noted that the cabin's lights had remained illuminated for approximately 4.5 weeks. When she sent her son to check on the Perrys, there was no answer at the door. On January 5, 1994, Officer Applewhite, a criminal investigator with the Mississippi State Patrol, visited Rubenstein's home in Louisiana to interview family members. However, Doris appeared to be heavily medicated, yielding no valuable information. At this juncture, the police were diligently gathering information, yet no significant suspects had emerged. However, the landscape shifted dramatically on January 12th, when an interview with Daryl's brother, David, unveiled a startling revelation. David disclosed that Rubenstein had procured a life insurance policy worth $250,000 in Crystal's name 2 years prior, in 1991. This revelation positioned Rubenstein as the primary suspect. To delve deeper into the intricacies of the policy, an insurance agent from New York Life in Louisiana was summoned to the investigation. He verified the policy's authenticity, noting that the application was submitted on September 13, 1991, with the policy set to mature in 1993, mere months before the tragic events unfolded. The policy designated Doris as Crystal's blood relative as the owner and primary beneficiary, while Rubenstein was listed as the secondary beneficiary, with Crystal's parents as the third beneficiaries, further intensifying the growing suspicions. David also provided detectives with another pivotal detail. He asserted that Rubenstein had misled them regarding his visit to the cabin on November 26th. In truth, he had been there on November 16th, having learned of the visit from Daryl the following day. This discrepancy heightened suspicions surrounding Rubenstein, as it could potentially connect him to the murders, given that autopsy reports estimated the family's demise to have occurred around November 16th. Once again, Rubenstein was summoned for questioning, and when probed about his activities on November 16th and 17th, he promptly invoked his right to legal counsel. Despite the collection of fingerprints, DNA, and blood samples from the crime scene by Officer Applewhite, none matched Rubenstein, and he failed to substantiate his presence at the cabin on November 16th. The evidence against him remained insufficient for prosecution, prompting officials to continue their search for leads. With the absence of concrete evidence and Rubenstein securing legal representation, detectives turned their attention to another potential suspect, Sidney Page. He was an African-American man entangled in an affair with Annie during the tumultuous 90s, while Daryl was incarcerated. To shield Crystal from Sidney, whom she had begun to affectionately refer to as her stepdaddy, Doris and Rubenstein took on the responsibility of her care. Rubenstein asserted that Sidney had ample motive to commit a crime, citing his severe drug addiction and his obsessive desire for Annie. Sheriff Glynis informally noted that following the interview, Rubenstein pounded his fist on the roof of his vehicle, unleashing a torrent of racist comments about Sidney, expressing his fears that Sidney might take Crystal away. During his interrogation, Sidney recounted that he first met Annie in 1989, claiming they were merely friends at that time. He admitted to selling drugs and serving a prison sentence from January 1990 to February 1991. Upon his release, he reconnected with Annie at a mutual gathering, leading to a serious romantic involvement. Meanwhile, Daryl's life was marked by instability, with frequent stints in prison. Sydney recounted that after several months of dating Annie, they moved into their own apartment, cohabiting for nearly 8 months, while Crystal remained with Doris and Rubenstein. Sydney made it abundantly clear that Rubenstein was deeply racist, harboring intense animosity towards African Americans. He revealed that Rubenstein never permitted him to meet Crystal and disclosed a more sinister reality about Rubenstein's actions. Sydney testified that Rubenstein had exploited Annie physically on multiple occasions, as both Daryl and Annie relied on him for sustenance and financial support. Annie's friend, Sue Bellow, recounted to detectives an incident where Annie sought $30 from Rubenstein to purchase a birthday gift for Crystal, overhearing him agree to assist her on the condition that she repay him with her body. Kelly, a dear confidant of Annie, recounted a particular incident when Crystal contracted chickenpox. During this time, she sought both medication and financial assistance from Rubenstein, who insisted that Annie share his bed first. Furthermore, Kelly unveiled Rubenstein's attempts to persuade Annie into signing a certain document. While this information was pivotal to the investigation, it did not definitively establish whether Rubenstein had visited the cabin on November 16th, or if he played a role in the tragic demise of the family. On January 26, 1994, Doris and Rubenstein claimed a substantial $250,000 from the insurance policy, and with no further leads to pursue, the case grew cold. Nearly 5 years later, in 1998, Officer Applewhite encountered Bill Goodwin, the Deputy District Attorney of Pike County, who was engaged in a similar case involving a father who murdered his child for insurance proceeds. Upon learning of Goodwin's successful conviction in that case, Applewhite entrusted him with the file concerning the 1993 Perry murders. After delving into the details, Goodwin recognized the necessity of consulting Dr. William Bass, a distinguished expert with 4 decades of experience studying the decomposition of bodies in various environmental conditions, including the role of insects. Dr. Bass possessed the acumen to determine the time elapsed since death. Upon reviewing the autopsy and crime scene photographs, he promptly affirmed that the Perry family had been deceased for over a month. His conclusion was grounded in the life cycle of the blowfly. Dr. Bass elucidated that these flies are typically the first to arrive at a corpse, feeding for several days and laying hundreds of eggs that hatch into maggots. These maggots consume the body and mature over a span of more than 2 weeks. Subsequently, they undergo metamorphosis, encased in a black covering known as pupal cases. After 5 to 6 days, the pupal case breaks open, giving rise to a new fly. This entire process requires a minimum of 1 month. Dr. Bass possessed a firm conviction regarding the timing of the deaths. However, he was unable to locate any pupal cases in the photographs to substantiate the complete life cycle of the blowflies. The evidence remained tenuous, yet the corroborated testimony of an esteemed expert, like Dr. Bass, was sufficient to warrant an arrest. In September 1998, the Pike County Sheriff's Department apprehended Rubenstein on charges of murdering Daryl Perry, Evelyn Annie Perry, and their young daughter Crystal, leading to his incarceration in Pike County Jail. During his time as an inmate, Rubenstein formed a bond with fellow inmate James Stevens, confiding in him and inadvertently simplifying his own case. Stevens later recounted that Rubenstein confessed to him about the murders, revealing that he had killed his stepson, his stepson's wife, and their daughter to benefit from an insurance policy. He recounted the brutal details of how he approached the cabin and stabbed Daryl and Annie until he was certain they were dead. While he did not elaborate on Crystal's death, it was presumed to involve strangulation or choking. Stevens's testimony led to Rubenstein being indicted for the capital murder of Crystal, along with the murders of Daryl and Annie. The initial trial in 1999 spanned 12 days, but culminated in a mistrial due to the jury's inability to reach a consensus. The case was retried in 2000, with Dr. William Bass present in the courtroom, observing as the state medical examiner provided testimony. As images from the autopsy were displayed, Dr. Bass, upon seeing a close-up of Crystal that he had not previously encountered, requested permission from the judge to review the images again. Upon closer inspection, he discovered pupil cases on Crystal's head in this new image, dispelling any lingering doubts regarding the timing of the murders and Rubenstein's culpability. Ultimately, the trial concluded with the jury convicting Rubenstein on all 3 murder charges on February 5, 2000. Alan Michael Rubenstein received a death sentence for the capital murder of Crystal, accompanied by 2 consecutive life sentences for the murders of Darrell and Annie. In 2009, 9 years later, while Rubenstein remained on death row in Pike County, a significant development occurred. The Mississippi Supreme Court annulled his death penalty, citing that the presiding judge in the original trial had neglected to inform the jury of all available sentencing alternatives. Presently, Rubenstein continues to serve his time in prison, enduring 2 life sentences and an additional life term without the possibility of parole. The souls of Annie, Darrell, and Crystal Perry now find eternal rest side by side at West Lawn Memorial Park in Louisiana. An inmate acquaintance of Rubenstein, Earl Ballinger, disclosed to investigators that Rubenstein confessed to him about the murders of his first wife, his other daughter, and her boyfriend, each for distinct reasons. While Rubenstein has never admitted guilt in court regarding the Perry murders, one must ponder the implications of his confession. Could a man of his nature have potentially committed other heinous acts in the past?